All right, let's dive right into this explainer and, just for a moment, totally strip away the relentless digital noise of our screens. I want you to imagine traveling back to a prehistoric world, a place governed by the steady, natural rhythm of seasons and sunsets, rather than the frantic ticking of clocks and constant notifications. We often think of our modern, hyper-connected world as the absolute pinnacle of human existence, but our biology? Well, our biology tells a completely different story. Today we're going to explore the profound and honestly fascinating gap between the world we actually evolved for and the world we're currently living in.
Get this, 95%. It is just staggering to consider that for 95% of human history, our ancestors lived completely untethered as wandering hunter-gatherers. Think about that for a second. That means almost the entire timeline of our biological and psychological evolution happened not in cities and not on farms, but out in the open, moving with the herds and gathering the wild harvests of the earth.
When you visualize it, the contrast is completely humbling. That massive 95% chunk represents our Paleolithic past. Our modern sedentary lifestyle, everything from the very first planted wheat field all the way to the smartphone sitting in your pocket right now is just a tiny 5% sliver on the vast timeline of human existence. We are quite literally ancient creatures trying to navigate a brand new world.
So, to really wrap our heads around that ancient mind, let's step into a morning at a 23,000-year-old site in modern-day Israel called Aholot II. Waking up here wasn't triggered by an alarm, it was triggered by the fading embers of a fire. And keeping that hearth alive wasn't just about utility, it was the absolute center of survival, of learning, and of community. Sure, the fire provided safety from predators, but it was also the ultimate gathering place where food was shared and the deep, essential bonds of the group were forged.
And tracing this history back through specific archaeological sites across deep time completely shatters that brutish caveman myth we've all been taught. When we look at places like Blombo's Cave or Dolní Věstonice, we don't find ignorant wanderers stumbling blindly through the wilderness. Not at all. Instead, we discover humans who are masterful architects, deeply observant ecologists, and brilliant artists who understood their environment on an incredibly intimate level.
What absolutely blows my mind is the sheer encyclopedic knowledge they carried around. Without a single textbook, they were essentially botanists and chemists. For example, 50,000-year-old Neanderthal teeth found in Spain actually show the deliberate use of medicinal yarrow and chamomile to soothe pain and inflammation. They knew exactly which roots to boil twice to remove toxins and which plants to use as medicine, passing this massive, invisible library of knowledge down entirely through oral storytelling. Their engineering was just as next level. At Dolní Věstonice in Ice Age Europe, roughly 30,000 years ago, they engineered massive winter homes entirely out of mammoth tusks and ribs. But perhaps even more beautiful than their architecture was their compassion. Burials at this site include a woman who suffered from severe spinal deformities. The simple fact that she lived into adulthood demonstrates profound communal care. They protected and fed their injured and disabled. They didn't just abandon them. They also had this incredibly rich inner life. At Blombo's Cave in South Africa, we see the very dawn of abstraction around 75,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found geometric lines deliberately carved into red ochre and pierced shells that were worn as beads. This is humanity leaping from basic survival straight into imagination. To wear a bead or carve a pattern is essentially saying, I belong to this group, I belong to this story. It is the birth of shared memory and symbolic identity. And where did all these stories come to life? Right around the fire. The flickering campfire acted as humanity's very first hypnotic screen. Modern psychology actually shows that watching firelight calms our nervous system and activates the brain's default mode network, which is the part of the brain linked to daydreaming and reflection. The hearth was a theater for myth, for memory, and collective education. It literally transformed the night from a time of absolute terror into a time of intimacy.
But, it wasn't just humans drawn to that warmth. The domestication of dogs was a slow, beautiful biological feedback loop. Shy wolves started scavenging near human camps, and as humans began to tolerate them, a remarkable thing happened. Mutual eye contact actually triggered oxytocin, the bonding hormone, in both species. That empathy turned wild wolves into our protectors, our hunting partners, and eventually our very first buried companions, mourned exactly like human family members. Then we hit what is essentially a massive historical plot twist. For the longest time, we assumed humans had to settle down and invent farming before they could build monuments or invent religion. But Göbekli Tepe, in modern-day Turkey, totally flips that upside down.
Here, 12,000 years ago, nomadic foragers cooperated to build these monumental carved stone pillars. It proves that the hunger for the sacred, for ritual and community, actually came before agriculture. We built temples before we built towns.
So this brings us to what researchers call the Neolithic trap. When we finally did settle down to farm, yes, it gave us surplus and civilization, but it also introduced restricted, grain-heavy diets that literally stunted our growth. It brought crowded pathogens from livestock, which created the very first epidemics, and by introducing land ownership and surplus, it created hierarchy and inequality. We basically traded robust health and flexible mobility for permanence and a whole lot of anxiety.
And that transition must have been profoundly jarring. In fact, as the agricultural world took over, the builders intentionally entombed Göbekli Tepe in rubble. They painstakingly buried these massive stone circles, perhaps as a solemn mourning, a deliberate closure for the end of their nomadic, mythic worldview. They sealed away their ancient temples, just as the new era of fields and walls began to rise around them.
Which brings us directly to today's evolutionary mismatch. The core issue is simply this. We are all walking around with ancient Paleolithic nervous systems that are desperately trying to process a relentless digital world. Our biology just hasn't had the time to catch up to the concrete, the alarm clocks, and the constant pings of the 21st century.
Honestly, our modern epidemics of burnout and isolation make total biological sense when you look at it this way. Our bodies react to an angry email or a looming deadline exactly as if it were a prowling predator. But unlike a predator attack, which ends pretty quickly one way or another, modern stress just never resolves. Our dopamine loops get hijacked by social media scrolling, our circadian rhythms get shattered by blue light, and we suffer this profound physical loneliness because we evolved to live tightly knit in a tribe of 40, not isolated in singular apartments.
This is exactly why something like camping, or just sitting by a fire, feels so deeply restorative to us. It's not just a fun weekend hobby, it's a biological alignment. Staring into a campfire actively lowers our cortisol. Being outdoors, surrounded by a trusted group, aligns us with the ancestral, communal rhythm that our bodies actually crave. For a brief moment, our nervous system recognizes the environment it was built for, and it finally exhales.
So, what really happens when a Paleolithic mind is placed in a digital cage? Well, we feel that friction every single day. Obviously, we can't return to the Ice Age, but recognizing this mismatch is incredibly empowering. We have to figure out how to satisfy that ancient hunger for rhythm and community right here in the 21st century. The fire hasn't gone out, but in a world governed by screens, where will you choose to build your next hearth?